Good evening, everyone. I'm Janet Steinmeier. I'm the president of Lesley University, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to our fourth event in the 2021 Thought Leadership Series. Building on the speaker program we launched last year, we've invited to campus a diverse array of inspiring guests from across the human arts and across the world. Our guest tonight is speaking to us from Australia, where it's already Friday morning, and as she just mentioned to me, very hot. A common thread among this year's roster of speakers is a focus on strengthening human connections, improving health and wellness, and expanding opportunities for people with disabilities, and the gaps in these areas that the pandemic has brought to the fore. These areas are where Lesley's work at the intersection of counseling, education, and the arts, and through our Threshold program, has never been more relevant or impactful. And I think, as most of you know, our Threshold program offers a college experience to students with a variety of learning differences, including students on the autism spectrum. Last fall, we heard Massachusetts Commissioner for the Blind, David D'Arcangelo, talk about furthering employment opportunities for the visually impaired. We also heard from puppet theater artist Nick Lehane, whose work has explored the psychological trauma of social isolation on a chimp that was taught ASL to communicate with the human family that raised him. Next month, we'll hear from Marcia Medali, the CEO of Riverside Community Care, a leading nonprofit behavioral health care and human service provider. But to explore another dimension of this theme, I'm very pleased to welcome Jodi Rodgers to talk about her work counseling neurodiverse patients on sexuality and healthy relationships. Some of you may be familiar with Jodi's work as a relationship coach through the Netflix reality TV series Love on the Spectrum, which profiles several young adults on the autism spectrum as they navigate the dating scene. The show struck a chord with viewers of all abilities. One reviewer described it as an affecting show that paints telling portraits of human connection that are so lovely, so moving, and so wholly satisfying, it's hard to imagine reality dating being done in any other way. Last fall, Jodi was the subject of a New York Times interview entitled, "We Could All Use a Jodi in Our Lives." She described how she went from working in disability services and as a special education teacher to getting a degree in counseling and a master's in sexual health counseling. Her practice is called Birds and Bees, and its bedrock principle is inclusivity. Sexual rights are human rights. Everyone has the same rights. While her star turn on Netflix, coaching and counseling people on the spectrum has raised her visibility globally, Jodi's approach to developing and sustaining healthy, intimate relationships applies universally. We can't wait to hear from her and to hear your questions. And after Jodi's talk, Jen Thorell, the executive director of our Threshold program, will lead a brief question and answer session. But for now, in this stressful time when so many people are facing mental health challenges and stronger human connections are so urgently needed, I enthusiastically second the New York Times in saying that now especially, we all need a Jodi in our lives. And I'm so pleased that she's with us tonight. Good day, Jodi.
Hi, good day. How are you?
We're all very good. Thank you for being with us.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm just going to share with you the presentation that I'll talk to, if that's all right, just so that everybody's not so focused on me for the whole time. So this is thanks for having me, everyone. It's a bit strange to be talking from across the globe to everybody, and I hope you can see this presentation okay. So what I wanted to do with everyone today is just really look at this. It's really about what we'll be doing for the next hour together. And an hour for me goes very, very quickly. So I was really just going to share with you all a little bit about, who I am and how I ended up talking with you all. And this just really to have a generic understanding of what sexuality and relationships and disability is all about. And then sort of talk about some of the difficulties that a lot of people in the community have with thinking about the difference between, the vulnerability and the human rights of people with disability in terms of, some of the difficulties that people have within this area. And then just have some time just for having a chat, really, which is my favourite part more than anything else. So I thought I'd just start with letting you sort of all know a little bit about me. I originally started in Australia as a very young woman at about 18, doing direct support work in families' homes and in the community. So I really worked, it's not bottom up because I think, direct support work is highly integral. But at that point, I was also doing an education degree and quickly got a postgraduate degree. To be a special ed teacher in Australia, you have to have postgraduate qualifications. I don't know whether that's the same in the United States or not. But so I quickly got a postgraduate degree and ended up working in what we call a segregated special school. So that's what this picture is. This is a school that I worked in. And this was a high school that had about 200 plus students between 12 and 20 years old in that school. I was the youngest person on staff by about 20 years. And the reason that I've got the year 1992 is that in Australia in 1992, we had a new system come into play, and that system was all about disability, what we call disability service standards. So it was really based on the rights of people with disability to have the same education as every single other young person in Australia. Prior to 1992, if a young person was in a segregated setting, it didn't follow the national curriculum. So it was a lot of day-to-day sort of functional independence, but not following a curriculum that everybody else was following. So I have a very, very clear memory of the principal coming into the school and going through a list of the subject areas that we'd be teaching in a high school. And as she was going through, she got to the health education section of it and then said, oh, health education, this includes, healthy eating, da, da, da. And then she said, and it also includes sexuality education. And then she looked at me and then said, so Jodi, that's what you'll be focusing on. Now, 1992, there wasn't a lot around about sexuality education, and particularly how we modified mainstream sexuality education to a population of people that really needed to learn in a very different way or communicated in a different way. So I started at that point. Then throw me forward, multiple years. And during that time, I sort of worked within the education system, but then became very, very conscious that many people with disability were not getting even very good access to counselling. And when I'm talking about counselling, I'm talking generic counselling. So it may have been that they weren't having access to counsellors that could provide grief counselling or trauma counselling, or even counselling just based on anxiety. So at that point, I then added another qualification and did a counselling degree. But then the further I got into that, the more I realised that there was just very, very limited access to sexuality counselling and relationship counselling for this population of people. So I put my money where my mouth was and then did a master's qualification in sexual health counselling or human sexuality. And then for the last 6 years, I think I established my own private practice about 6 years, could be 7, time flies, 7 years ago. And I work in private practice, specialising in working with all of my clients. Every single client that I work with either has an intellectual disability or cognitive disability, as we call it in Australia. They are a neurodivergent person, or they may have an acquired brain injury. And I also work with a population of people that have mental health difficulties. So I only work with that population of people, and I specialise in all areas of sexuality and relationships, including couples counselling as well. So it's excellent. I've got a really, really brilliant job. But then randomly, I was speaking at, I was actually doing a training and workshop for sexologists. That's what we call ourselves, or sex therapists. And I was doing a training at the Australian National Sexology Conference. And what I was training on is how sexologists and sex therapists need to modify the way that they deliver counselling so that it could be inclusive of autistic people. And while I was part of that, I was approached by Northern Pictures, a production team, who asked me, originally I thought they just were asking me if I could help them find some autistic people for the show. But what ended up happening is that they asked me if I would be part of this show. And it was going to be broadcast, or it was broadcast originally on our Australian Broadcasting Commission, which is our free-to-air government-run television. So in my mind, I thought I was going to be on the television for, 3 minutes, basically, that hardly anybody would see it, and I'd be on one season, not even one season, one episode, and that would really be it. But the show was so popular in Australia that by the time the 4th episode actually aired, it actually beat the ratings of every other program in Australia on free-to-air television. And from that, just word of mouth spread very quickly, and it was picked up by Netflix. And before I knew, it was broadcast globally across the world. It's in now, I think, 210 countries, and has been subtitled and dubbed into 7 different languages, which is quite good with my Australian accent. I'd hope that would be helpful to people. So it's really taken my world from something, I'm a clinician and a therapist, and that's where my base is with working with people. But the thing that I always think about is that this has given a global appreciation about how diverse autism is and the presentation of autism, but it's also started a conversation with many, many people just about people's need for intimate sexual romantic relationships, which I think had been not talked about within the general population. That hadn't been talked about a lot. So for me, if it's about anything at all, if it's about the education for the general population, then I think that that's a really wonderful thing. So what I wanted to just sort of have a look at with you is that I really wanted, before I get a little bit more into sexuality and relationships and disability and put those 3 concepts together, I just really wanted us to have a think about how broad the concept of sexuality is. Most people, when you deliver training and you say that you're talking about sexuality, they go straight for, sorry, this is very wordy, and for anybody that has literacy difficulties, I'll talk through it with you. But a lot of people, when you talk about sex education, just go straight for the act of sex. And when they're talking about that, they're really talking about from a very heterosexist perspective. They're talking about a man and a woman and the act of penetrative sex, and they're not thinking about how huge this all is. So when I talk about sexuality, I'm talking very, very broadly. And the last thing that you see there that it says under sexuality is expression of self. And from my perspective and point of view, your sexuality is everything. Your sexuality is so deeply embedded in all about who you are. And so for me, when I'm counselling, I'm not just talking about the act of sex. I'm talking about the whole realm of this. So we've really got to think about the fact that, the population of people that I work with and that we all work with, they can be either biologically male, female, or intersex. And, I work with people with Turner's syndrome, that also has a presentation with autism, where their sexuality and their biological sex is differing from just a black and white male, female. And then we've got to include, people who their gender is not male or female that was assigned at birth, that they may be transgender or non-binary or gender fluid. And there's incredible research coming out at the moment about the number of autistic people who are transgender or non-binary. That's not saying every single autistic person is transgender or non-binary, but there is a large presentation of people who are transgender and non-binary within the autistic community. So then the next part that I really look at with people is about sensuality. And I love this component of it because if you think about sensuality, it's really looking at the senses. And if we look at the senses and we're thinking about autistic people, then we all know that there can be sort of sensory processing differences or difficulties, and that's really integral as part of who we are. I do a lot of talk to people about the fact that if you understand your own sensuality, and your own sensuality is just really, really feeling good about yourself, and then that's got impact on your self-esteem and your body image, how you're able to present yourself when you're meeting other people. And then we get into the sexual part. So the sexual part is all about sexual health, sexual function and dysfunction, helping people understand the radical changes that people go through in puberty. And if we particularly put autistic people and change into the same sentence, then we all know that that's got complexity to it. There's a large area of population that I work with that when we're talking about fantasy and having the cognitive capacity to understand the difference between fantasy and reality, and that what they may be viewing is not real. That's been really impacted on the amount of people that I'm working with that are accessing explicit material and learning about sexuality online, which is a minefield of difficulty for many people. But it's also an amazing thing because lots of people would think that if somebody does not have literacy skills, then they may not be able to access. But as we know, that one of the beautiful things about IT and technology in this day and age is that you can do voice command and really Google search anything that you want to, but that also adds to some difficulties with it as well. When I talk about sexual behaviour, I realise that a lot of people within the community are left very, very vulnerable because we only talk about sexual behaviours in one shape or form. If people are not taught really bluntly and specifically about the array of what sexual behaviours look like and have open discussion about that, that can lead them to being in very, very risky, vulnerable situations because they've never had the education of that. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about that in a minute. And then really, so when we're looking at sexuality as well, we're talking about, you know, intimate relationships, and we're talking about a person's capacity to be vulnerable with another person. We're talking about a person's capacity to have an understanding of reciprocity in relationships and negotiation and theory of mind. So understanding things from another person's perspective. It's huge. It is so big. And I think that that's the wonderful part about my job, is that I'm learning about the diversity of sexuality every single day. And then if you lay that on top of the array of diversity in which people who learn differently or communicate differently or comprehend differently or perceive the world differently than a neurotypical population, then I'm learning every single day about those two areas. And the joy of my job is trying to bring those two components together to make sure that every single person has really good access to this information. So I really wanted to just touch on this briefly, that we have ratified the rights of persons with a disability. And I'm sure everybody that I'm speaking to today, not that I can see you, which would be wonderful if I could, but I'm sure all of us would say that we believe in these rights, and we believe that people with disability have the same rights as every single person. And if you have that belief, then part of that belief system, I just showed you that because it's very wordy, but part of that belief system and understanding those rights is this, that every single person on this planet has a right to, you know, enjoy their own sexuality and express their own sexuality and explore their own sexuality. That's a really basic human right for all of us. But there's also a right that every single person has the right to receive this information and be provided with sexual health education and sexuality education, and receive that information in a way that is understood by them, that is completely accessible to them. And I can get on my bandwagon about accessibility quite a bit. The fact that when we talk about accessibility, it's not just having accessibility to a physical location. It's not just about putting in a ramp or having accessible toilets. Accessibility is access to all components of what we all enjoy. And part of that accessibility is making all areas of education accessible for people. And that means modifying every single thing that we do so that a person is able to learn and able to have the information that all the rest of us have received, sometimes not just through school, I've got to tell you, but we all receive this in differing ways. So that's my area, that all I want to do is make sure that every single person that I work with and hang out every single day receives information to make really informed decisions about sexuality and the way that they'd like to explore their sexuality that doesn't leave them vulnerable. But this is also one of the most pleasurable parts of our life. And if you talk to any person about what makes a good life, apart from if they're asexual, most people will talk about the fact that they really want to have an intimate romantic relationship with another person. And that in actual fact, many people that I work with come to me saying, I want a boyfriend or a girlfriend. And one of the sad components for me is that when I ask them why, they will say, because that's what everybody else has. That's what makes you have a good life, to be loved by somebody in that manner and to be able to love somebody in that manner. And so I think it's really, really integrally important that we honour that and honour that desire, because it's a desire that a large majority of the population also desire. The other thing I just wanted to make sure that I talk about this a lot, that I don't think that we really acknowledge that 15% of the human population have a disability. And so we've really got to be making sure that if there's 15% of people that are doing things differently, then it's really important for all of us to be making sure that 15% is included in all of this and all that we do. I just hold that number in my head all the time because it is a constant reminder to me, am I being inclusive of the 15? Yeah, are the 15 being included? I wish I could be talking to you face to face, because I really just wanted you to sort of reflect a little bit on where you received your sexuality education from. Where did you learn about relationships? And when I do this with people face to face in training, this can blow out as a really amazing discussion, but a lot of it comes down to things like that people learn about sexuality education and sex by either reading in books and magazines, what they've seen on television, accessing the internet, conversations with family and parents. Only that drops away often when people are teenagers. So therefore they learn through their peers. There's a lot of peer discussion that goes on. With relationships, people learn about relationships by having the capacity to watch other people. They learn from the family that they're with. They learn from their interactions with other people. They learn about relationships all the way through childhood. And then they learn through trial and error of being able to be within a peer group and be able to practice different things and learn from that. So it's a constant learning throughout their life. The reason I think it's really important for us all to be reflective of this is that we need to think about the barriers that are created for people if they don't have access or experience to all of that and those components of life. So we've really got to think about how does, intellectual disability or cognitive disability or being neurologically diverse, how does that impact on sexuality and sex education? And I'm probably preaching to the converted. I'm pretty sure I'm preaching to the converted right now, but we've really got to think about the fact that if you have a cognitive disability or you are neurologically diverse, and remember, this is just very generalized. This isn't every single person that you work with, but we know that people learn at a slower rate. So therefore the information needs to be given again and again and again. People may have communication issues, which means that they may not actually ask the question. If you're somebody that isn't able to initiate communication or doesn't ask from somebody else, then we've got to be very, very mindful that we've got to find those teachable moments on a day-to-day basis to be able to start these conversations with somebody. Communication issues also, relate to peer interactions and learning from peers. We've got to think about a person's developmental delay. I hope I'm using the right terminology for all of you, because it's different in Australia than it is in other parts of the world. And when I'm talking about developmental delay, sometimes when a family comes to see me, or a caregiver or a parent comes to see me, and their young person is exploring their sexuality, or they're maybe displaying sexualized behaviors, sometimes it's a really great celebration, because people may be developmentally lagging in other areas, or they may have global developmental delay in other areas, but sometimes when they hit puberty, it is one of the times that they're actually hitting a developmental milestone at exactly the right time and exactly the right way. So, biologically, when your body's going through puberty, it's happening at the right time, often chronologically, and it's just about surrounding and supporting the other areas to have an understanding of that. We all know that if you have literacy difficulties, then if you don't have access to books, or often books are written in a way that are non-accessible in this area of understanding. Sometimes the books are not written in a blunt and explicit way, or have enough visual support for people to understand this. I always talk about the fact that if we went back to the education I had about sexuality, I literally had somebody, they pulled down a wall chart that just had the internal organs of a male and female body, but it could have been a map of Europe as far as I was concerned at that stage. So if we're not also helping people understand by using visual supports that are really relatable to them, then it means nothing. It comes out without any comprehension involved. And then that's the other part, the difficulties with comprehension or abstract thinking. So we've really got to make sure on a daily basis that the person that we are with, every single individual, is able to comprehend, and with their literacy level. Do they need something that is more real life? Do they need to have photos? Do they understand a line drawing? Are they able to understand words? So we've got to take that on note every single time. When you're talking about sex and sexuality, then it gets into a minefield of showing real life images to people, also can be very complex and difficult. One of the difficulties that I also think a lot is about the generalization of those skills. So understanding that when we look at something on television, or when we're learning about this, how do we translate that into our day-to-day life? How do we move that into our day-to-day existence? Then just basic social skills. And one of the things that I'm highly aware of is that many young people learn about sex and sexuality and relationships, particularly in their teenage years and in adulthood, by being part of a social network with peers. And if you are a person that doesn't have accessibility to a peer group, or you have spent your whole life not being able to just have a little bit of risk, or you've constantly been supported by somebody else, sometimes you don't get that interaction with peers. You don't get to have those discussions. And then the other part is impaired executive functioning. So that's really understanding, about consequence and about planning, abstract thinking and flexible thinking and adaptive thinking. And it's also about impulsivity and impulse control in those areas. So we've got to take all of that into consideration within sexuality and relationship counselling. And then the other part, when we're talking about relationship counselling with people, I'll often have people when they come to me and say, I want a boyfriend or a girlfriend. but many people that I work with can't even name one friend. And when I'm talking about friendships, if you saw the television show, you'd see that I really work on this step-to-step basis, in the fact that we practice relationship skills throughout our whole lives, and it starts from birth, and it starts within our families, and then it moves into early childhood and primary school, high school. But we are learning through relationships in simple things. So if a person has never invited a friend over, they've never had a friend at their house, they've never even been out with a friend to somewhere in an environment where they've just been one-on-one, they've never even been to the movies with a friend, they've never been unsupported in those environments, but then they reach an age where they're saying, I want a boyfriend or a girlfriend, but often they've missed these really basic skills of just independent skills that actually you need to be able to go out on a date with somebody else. A lot of autistic people I work with have difficulty, they might be on Tinder, or they might be on lots and lots of dating sites, but they actually have a lot of difficulty understanding even the reciprocity that happens within that, and how we build relationships slowly, and the vulnerability that can come. I could talk about this for hours, so I'm not going to, because literally I want to provide opportunity for you to all be able to chat and speak about it. But it's really going back to the basics of friendship skills and social skills and social interaction. Another component of this that's really, really important for me is that, particularly when I'm working with autistic people, it's not about teaching autistic people neurotypical skill, it's teaching and supporting an autistic person to help have the self-advocacy skills that when they are wanting to enter into the dating world, or they would like to develop intimate and romantic relationships, do they have the capacity to be able to explain to another person what their need is? Are they able to explain to somebody else why they have difficulty with eye contact, what sensuality is for them, what touching might be like for them, what their communication style is, why they may need a break, what environments are going to be good for them. So it's never about saying this is how you should do it, this is what it's like. It's being able to support that person to be able to express themselves to another person, so that their needs are met, and that they're able to be open and truthful about their autism. It's not just autism, it's all areas. And I'm sure that anyone can appreciate that when you go on a first date with somebody, that's a really difficult thing to do, to negotiate that. You wanted to be putting forward your best self, so you're not sure what parts of yourself you should be putting forward or not. So I do a lot of practice with people in what information that they would like to provide to a person that they've just met, and what information that they can then layer onto as that relationship becomes a much more trusted relationship. Really, when I do trainings on sexuality and disability, and I train in two different areas. I train within the disability community, and within the disability community, I'm helping people from frontline support workers to psychologists and counsellors, and any other therapists that were teachers aides, helping them to have a really good understanding on relationships and sexuality, and how this needs to be embedded into day-to-day practice. There shouldn't be people like me. There shouldn't be therapists in this area that specialise. This should be something that everybody's doing, because sexuality is every single day. But when I'm in that area, I'm always talking about, the disability field, I'm talking about sexuality and relationships, but then I also cross over and work within the community where I'm working with counsellors and relationship specialists and sexologists and sex therapists and doctors and medical people, to support and help them understand how they can modify their practice so that they can be way more inclusive of anybody that may have difficulty with communication or comprehension, so that they are also being inclusive of something that I think is a fundamental right for absolutely everybody. And we should have a whole community that can speak about sexuality and relationships in a very, very broad and open way. Just to kind of finish off with you, people get really, really worried not finishing off with you because I'll be right open for good conversation, but we've got to remember that a lot of people are really worried about this. A lot of people, I always throw it back to kind of the 1980s where people say, oh, we can't be teaching people about condoms because if we teach about condoms, everybody's going to go and have sex. We know that education's power, and education allows people to make really good informed decisions and not leave them vulnerable. And so I think that what we need to think about is that sexual vulnerability, statistically, people with disability, particularly people with intellectual and cognitive disability and other disabilities too, statistically they are way more vulnerable to sexual abuse and sexual assault, but that's due to the fact that they have a lack of education. They have not had this discussion, and this might be pretty full on for some people, but I talk a lot about this story that one young woman, I was doing a training for people with a disability. So there was 40 adults in the room, and I am quite blunt in my training. So I was going through the different types of behaviours. And when I talk about behaviours, I talk about, any touching of the hands onto the private parts of the body. And we go through that very explicitly. I talk about the mouth on any parts of the private body. And then we sort of move forward to there. But when I talked about oral sex with this group of people, there was one young woman that became quite upset, needed to leave the room, and was supported to do that. And what we found out afterwards is that she had been performing oral sex on a known person to her that she didn't know, and was being coerced into doing this. But because no one had ever told her that a thing called oral sex existed, she didn't actually know it was sex. And they weren't using the word sex. The person was using, a word that most of us will know, but I'm not going to say it because I feel a little bit, I don't know whether I can say those things or not. But she was left vulnerable because nobody had ever educated her about this. And we all know that we can see televisions on Netflix and Stan every single day where we'll see a person kind of come up from the bottom of the bed, and we know through all of our life skills what's just happened. But if you're somebody that has not had that education, if you're somebody that has never had somebody talk to you about that, then how are you to know? It does leave people vulnerable. It's teaching people about the rules, about the age of consent, about privacy, about who we can and can't have sex with, really explicitly. It's teaching consent education. And, I'm really, really happy in Australia. We've just in the last 2 weeks had our government make a statement that consent education has now been mandated into Australian education system from kindergarten. I don't know what you guys would call that, the earliest childhood, all the way up to the senior years of high school. Every single person will be learning about consent in our community. People are left vulnerable when they have social skill difficulties, or they haven't had education about relationship, what a reciprocal relationship looks like. And when I'm talking about the ethics of sex, I'm really talking about consent and about a person's self-esteem and ability to be able to express yes or no when they want to, and be able to make informed choice. That's what leaves people vulnerable, and that's what leaves them vulnerable to sexual abuse and sexual assault. But the other thing I think that is really, really important to talk about is that I work with a population of people that have stepped into the judicial system and have stepped into an area. I work with people that have been incarcerated, and they've been incarcerated because they have sexually offended. And the interesting thing about that is exactly the same things. People sexually offend when they come from a population of people with cognitive or intellectual disability, or they're autistic due to lack of education, due to understanding of consent, due to understanding how to initiate, due to not being able to question a person, due to social interaction skills, and due to really, really understanding what this ethics of sex is all about, and that every single person has a right to make these informed decisions. I could harp on for ages, couldn't I? But I shouldn't. But because we've only got a bit of time, maybe we'll just throw it open to questions. I don't know how this is going to work, but hopefully hopefully that's given you some kind of background and understanding of where I'm coming from. But yes, I've got a bit of time if I can answer any questions for people. I might just stop this sharing if that's all right, so that I can see people quicker. I can throw this back up later. That's just information on how to get hold of me. But
Jodi, thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Really for sharing your knowledge with us about this incredible work that you do. I could sit here and listen to you all night or all day in your case. But we're going to open it up to some questions. We have a lot of questions. Of course, we won't get to all of them, but I'm going to start it off. Can you talk to me about your thoughts on balancing being protective so folks aren't exploited versus providing the education to support the neurodiverse community in healthy exploration?
Yeah, this is a really, really difficult one for many people. And this is a question often that comes from people that support a person with disability. It often doesn't come from the person themselves, interestingly enough. The people that I work with want the education, they want the knowledge, they want to have this information so that they're able to make decisions for themselves. But this is a really complex and difficult one for all of us that are wanting to make sure that that person is not left vulnerable to this. I think it's the same way how I work it and treat it is the same way that we would do for any person in the community, any child. We provide the information in a way that is directly related to their experience and their knowledge. I mean, we don't talk to children at different spaces about this sexuality area, but we're feeding information about this every single day. And when that person has the capacity to go out and do this for themselves, then we have to allow for that to happen. And when I say we have to allow that to happen, the person themselves is also making a choice of when this happens. It's so difficult because when we're also talking about this, I also acknowledge that part of this is also we've got to take into account every single family has its own culture. Every family does. And families' cultures are embedded in their religion and ethnicity and race and their age, where they come from, what their understanding of sex and sexuality is all about. So the difficulty of answering that question is that it's very individualistic as well. I think that we have to take on every single family's understanding, but I work with the individual themselves, and so I follow their lead often. I suppose I'll just get back to harping on we need to provide accessible information and then we limit the vulnerability. I don't know whether that answered the question actually, Jen, but
No, it's a complex question. I think that, families and, like you said, caregivers and others often have that question about how to balance it. In your experience, what is the biggest challenge for the disability community around these topics?
I think because we have infantile many people with a disability, and it's shifting and changing. Thank goodness that it is. But I think that we still look at adults with a disability as children and childlike, and that's radically shifting and changing now. But for one, it takes ages to break down these barriers and these myths. So, I'm sure that all of you would agree that there was a certain point where people talked about a person with Down syndrome, they're so lovable, or they're so cute and lovable. And yeah, maybe they are, until they're a 14-year-old boy that's hugging every person in the street. And then it becomes a sexualized behavior. Like, it's really interesting that we still do not, I think the majority of the community actually don't even know what typical sexual development is. And I swear to that we don't. If I ask any person, which I don't on a daily basis, but we don't know what it is for the typical community. So therefore, we don't know what that looks like where somebody's needing support to kind of not have that developmental disability or not have that developmental kind of offshoot from it. So I think the biggest thing is really breaking down the myth to start with. One, that all people with a disability are not asexual. People seriously believe that if you have a disability, you don't have a sexy thought ever. You're not thinking about sex. They don't think that people, I still work with a community of people that if you say a person with a disability has an erection and wants to have sex, they nearly fall over. So I don't know what it is that we have put sexuality in this box, and we have made people think that if you have a disability, then you actually are not a sexual being. And that takes a long, long, long time to break that apart and challenge that thinking. I think that's the biggest barrier for me, that it's just really breaking that open and just saying every single person on the planet has sexuality and expresses their sexuality in one form or another.
Yeah, thank you. That's I think that's come to the forefront recently with the Victoria's Secret model recently, who is a person with Down syndrome. And there's a lot of feelings about that, but she is a sexual being and she's being seen as that. And it's something to celebrate. What are your thoughts on dating websites with the neurodiverse population?
Oh, that's so complex and difficult as well, because I can only speak generalistically about that. But every individual is different. And so when we're even looking at the autistic community, every single person I hang out with, and so people with cognitive disability, it's really different for every single person. Some dating sites are horrendous. Some are great. Interestingly, I think people worry about dating sites, but I worry more about open chat rooms. I've had, I won't even say the name, but literally I've just had somebody in the last couple of days that is on a site that the site's called and its next line is talk to strangers. So, people are in there. And if people are socially isolated, which we know in the last couple of years has been absolutely horrific to start with, but if you are somebody that doesn't have a big peer group, you're not engaged in a lot of activities, then you seek interaction with people. And a lot of, this is the modern way that people meet somebody. I'm quite old, everybody, but, in my time, if you said, I'm getting on a dating site to pick, to meet somebody, that people had this whole thing going, that's so desperate. It had a whole culture. Most people meet people through dating sites these days. They're on these sites. And so why would anyone with disability be different from that? That's where people are meeting. What the important part of it is teaching the rules of what information we give out, what things that we offer that's intimate information, and about the safety of that. Because a lot of people are on social media because they want to see how many likes they've got. If you're somebody that doesn't have high self-esteem and you put yourself on a dating site and you get these people kind of sending multiple kisses to you, of course it builds your self-esteem. Of course it's the concept, this person obviously loves me and wants to be with me. That leads to vulnerability. I can't talk generally about every single dating site, and I can't talk about where there's a will, there's a way. I wouldn't even be worried about dating sites. People are interacting with each other through gaming, through chat rooms, through every type of social media. Most people I work with aren't even on dating sites. It's through Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat. It's everywhere. So it's just part of the new way of learning for anyone who's as old as me to get their heads around it, really.
So again, I think what you're saying is that it's really about the education still. So not necessarily banning somebody from being on all these dating apps, but knowing that they may and how to work with them on being able to be safe and not put themselves in vulnerable.
Exactly right. So when I'm working with people, I talk about how we develop and build relationships when we meet somebody face to face, but I also work on how we develop and a relationship when we're meeting somebody online. So we'll go through all of those steps of just having general chat. At what point, what information do you give out online? When do you move from, say, a dating site onto something like Skype? How do you know that person's a real person? Because this is the other thing. If you don't have abstract thinking, you may think that every single person that you're meeting on a dating site is actually the real person. They don't understand, that some people are doing this and they're not really themselves at all. So you've got to go through those steps. Then it's really teaching, if you are going to meet somebody face to face, where do we do it? We do it in a public place. We meet somebody for coffee. Also helping somebody have the social skills and negotiation to know how to get out of a situation. If they're sitting there and they think the person's absolutely boring, we all know that that's difficult to get out of those situations. So how do we help somebody's social skills to say, if you don't like this person, how do you get out of that? So, so I go through all of those steps with somebody. It's education.
Excellent. Thank you. So one question was, in your series, the parents were very supportive of their adult children in wanting to find love, and wondering how much you work with parents to accept the adult child's sexuality and how to support the expression.
Yeah, it's a little bit, it's a bit, in Australia, I'll just try and explain without going into too much detail. In Australia, we work within an insurance scheme. So every single individual with a disability in Australia is provided with funding that they can use for their own services. So that it's the choice and control model. The person themselves, with support, of course, from their family or another representative, help them then work out what services they want to purchase for themselves. Within that system, there's an area for parental and caregiver education and training. I am always open for, number one, always open for just doing individual work with people in Australia. I work with lots of families. But the other thing is that whenever I'm offering training, I do a lot of travel, and wherever I go to travel, I layer three things. So say I'll go out to a regional remote community, I do training specifically for adults with a disability. I do training for the professionals surrounding them, so any support workers in that community, but then I also run parental training as well. And a lot of the parental training is just what we're talking about. It's actually kind of thinking about our own attitudinal value about our child, about what that means. And really, and a lot of the parent ones I love that parent training, because it's about parents. We really struggle on a daily basis. I've put us into a we, so I like doing that, just weed us. But it's really about that fine line that we talk about that's complex and difficult, because everybody wants their child to have a fulfilled life. Everybody wants their child to live to their greatest capacity and to live a life full of great potential. But at the same point, none of us would ever want their child to be at risk. But I think the biggest thing that I always come back to is, you don't let your child run onto the road without teaching them road skills. And it's exactly the same as this. We teach the skills and we teach the education, but then we have to realize that as good parents, then we also have to allow for our adult children or our teenage children to go and practice this stuff.
Thank you. You touched on this a little bit, but I want to get a little bit deeper into it. Sort of celebrating that milestone of their coming into puberty age appropriately, where other developmental milestones may not have been met, in the order that they should, or delayed. What about the teenager who is experiencing arousal in settings that maybe shouldn't be? They're in a classroom, they're in school, and there's this attempt to redirect or prevent it. And how do you balance recognizing that this is normal sexual behavior or normal developmental behavior, in a way that doesn't put them in a position where they're vulnerable of being seen again as the person who is doing something inappropriate or having that experience inappropriately in a school setting?
Yeah. So one of the I go back to basics sometimes. Well, always. I always check every single person I meet or work with. I go, do they have a base understanding of public and private place and public and private parts of the body? And if somebody's non-verbal, I actually want to know whether they can indicate to a picture what a private part of the body is, or are they able to indicate to what a public-private place? If you're working with somebody that's kind of got, severe or profound intellectual disability, then we know that that needs more support, and often that needs guidance to it. But the base education is, does a person understand that I'm just going to masculinize it, but does a person understand their penis is only for a private place, touching their penis? And it's very different, if a young person's getting an erection and they're just in class with an erection, that's very different than a person actually kind of masturbating in class. So I'd be going straight back to say, does that person actually have a conceptual understanding that private parts of the body are for private places only? We all learn this. Every single one of us learn this at some point in our life. So it's, how do we support that education for somebody else? And of course, we don't want to be on somebody every single day, but in all the schools I work in and all the disability services that I work in, anywhere where there's groups of people, it's a fundamental thing that we actually say really quietly to somebody, make sure they've got the understanding, they've got the comprehension. And then if they're doing that based on impulsivity, then being able to redirect very quietly and say, Jen, that's for a private place. Private parts of the body for a private place. So you're just verbally prompting that person to remove themselves from that situation and go to a private place. I often teach, though, that a private place is at home. Mm-hmm. And then also, you've got to really think about that, because sometimes, we can go private places at home, and then Bobby tells you that he sleeps with his 3 brothers at home. So then you've got to make sure that you're really modifying it for that individual's. But the basics are, can you work out whether that person themselves is able to indicate on either a pictorial representation or physically? Phones are brilliant, because you can take a picture of just the whatever it is at the school or the environment that they're in, and even if somebody needs a visual support, you can actually prompt them by just showing them a picture of the bathroom. Mm-hmm. So you do that to kind of redirect them where they need to go. Most people who are typical developing, and we all know, young men learn that if they get an erection in class and they cover it up because it's a private place and remove themselves to its kind. But we learn that you don't masturbate in public. But how did we all learn that? And we all learnt it. So now we just got to modify it back for those people too. It's a daily basis for me. This is a day, every single day. And even if I'm working with somebody that may be in a sexual relationship with a partner, I still go back to basics. Does that person understand privacy is almost number one that you start from.
So Jodi, I think we could sit here all night, your day, and listen to you speak about your knowledge on this subject. But I have time for one more question. So I'm going to ask you, how do you address individuals who believe or express that sex education for the neurodiverse population is wrong or not appropriate?
I'll go back to vulnerability all the time. In Australia, we've just had what they call the Royal Commission into abuse and neglect and exploitation of people with a disability. And when you look at those 3 areas, the vulnerability of those areas, every single time it comes back to the same thing. If you think about, if we leave people vulnerable, if we don't educate them how to swim, we don't take somebody to a pool without teaching them how to swim. They're vulnerable. We don't teach somebody, road rules. Any part of life, none of us ever would expect somebody to enter an area where they would be left vulnerable without providing education. And for me, sex and sexuality is every single day. And I'm talking about, it is on the television every single day. It's in music every single day. People see it every single day. We live in a highly visually sexualized community, and we need to be teaching this. We need to do it. So when people kind of say, oh, we shouldn't be doing this, then I actually challenge them with that one and say, well, you know, and I think that people will often, I challenge them on the two sides as well. Do you really want to leave somebody vulnerable, open to abuse and neglect, or do you want to leave them vulnerable to offending behaviour? But then, Jen, do you know the other thing I do really, really quickly? I don't think that we're still so archaic in the way that we talk about sexuality. I think that most of us, if we really think about it, it is one of the most beautiful components of our life. You know, feeling like a sensual person, accessing our senses in a way that makes us, you know, I'll go back to even that thing. If you've been somebody that has had only clinical personal care your whole life, and you've never had anyone even just rub your body with essential oils, or think about what we do on a daily basis to make our environments more relaxed. And when I'm talking sensual, I'm not talking sexual arousal. I'm talking about we do this on a daily basis to make ourselves beautiful. And we don't talk about sexuality as an expression of pleasure or intimate relationships or affection or tenderness or romance or love. That's the side we need to be talking about. Why would we stop a person with disability from experiencing all of that joy? What gives us the right to do that? And why would we want to? Every person, I don't know how many people I'm talking to, but I know 100% that if I said to somebody, you know, would you begrudge somebody, or would you want to take away somebody's right to pleasure and a joyful life? All of us are going to say no. All of us want people with a disability to experience the full range of how wonderful the world is, and all the stuff that makes us happy. And this is just one thing that in my lifetime is so important. So there you go. I do it from both sides.
I can't thank you enough. This has been wonderful, such important work you do. And I know that I'm thinking, and probably others on here are thinking, when are you coming to the US to do this work with us and train us and help us, you know, understand this and work better with people. So thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Jodi, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. And for those of you who are local, enjoy the snow tomorrow.